It says there's two people waiting, and you don't seem to be streaming on YouTube. I'm looking at my channel. All right. Well, we'll continue on. Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries. It's the world we live in, right? When you're living online, stuff
Mm,
happens, right?
so many technical difficulties. It just,
Right.
I'm
So,
surprised if a week goes by where I don't have them.
right, right. I hear you. It happens. There's so many virtual meetings at this point that I experience similar things, and particularly in an area like this, which is primarily rural, uh, the ability to do things virtually has been lifesaver for all sorts of people. If we got any benefits at all out of the struggles that we went through during the COVID period, it's that rural communities in particular had a whole world opened up to them because of the pushes towards internet accessibility. It's still a huge issue up here. We still don't have enough access. It's not regular enough. It's not reliable enough, but it still is better than what we had before. So sometimes things do get better.
Well, that's good to know. Uh, Let me ask you this. What are, we're talking today about progressivism versus populism. That's the subject of today's show. What do those two terms mean to you?
Ah, well, first of all, one of those terms was, of course, invented here in Wisconsin by Senator Robert M. La Follette. He was known as Fighting Bob, and he was a member of the United States Senate. Oh, let's see, before I was born, he was member of the Senate from I don't know 1910 to about 1925, and he really created this term progressivism, and it's not a surprise that it was invented here or created here, because this is also the land of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Wisconsin idea. UW-Madison is the flagship school of the UW system, and it is predicated on what one of the early chancellors, almost the same time that Bob La Follette was in the Senate, one of the chancellors, Charles Van Hise, created this thing we call the Wisconsin idea. The Wisconsin idea was that all the fruits of the university should be available to all of the people of the state, regardless of whether they could travel here or whether they could take courses or not. This is the origin, the impetus and the origin for Wisconsin Public Radio, and the notion that there should be an extension, a university extension, which we still have. It's over 100 years old, and it brings education out to the population. Because of Wisconsin Public Radio, for most of the 20th century, Wisconsin had the best educated rural workforce, primarily farmers, in the entire country. And that's because we ran and still run in this state the University of the Air. So the idea was that all of the ideas that come out of universities, all of the science, all of the research, all of the work that is done to organize communities was done to make sure that every single person in the state, not just the wealthiest, not just the elite, would have access to those tools and those circumstances that helped them flourish and live their best life. That's progressivism right there. The idea that we work together as communities and within communities to make sure that everybody has access to tools and circumstances to live a good life. So that's progressivism. You want to go
Okay,
into populism?
let's go to populism.
Okay, so populism is a little bit trickier. It's a slippery sort of an eel. And it tends to ride in parallel with progressivism because, in some ways, there is an appeal to a certain set of people, which is people who have not been the beneficiaries of the bulk of the wealth of the country and society. So populism also looks to the people who feel like they haven't really gotten their fair share. The difference is that populism is a demagogic tool that is used to whip people up and play on their resentments and get them to work on behalf of what appears to be change, but almost never really is change. It almost always is something that exclusively benefits the demagogues who whip the people up. So one of these things is an actual philosophy designed to improve people's lives. The other one is a tool that is used by certain political elites to enhance their own position at the expense of, but using the strength of the population as a whole.
All right. So now we've defined the two words. We've just defined progressivism. We've defined populism. What are some examples of what we're seeing currently in the news of each thing?
Ouch. This could be painful. I was hoping you were going to ask me for the historic examples of these things.
Well, that's fine. You can go there first.
Well, the scary part about this is, and my background is in history. That time that I spent out on the East Coast, I spent in graduate school working on history and cultural anthropology. And although I was a specialist in European studies, I've always been a fan and excited about American history, partly because I'm born on the 4th of July. And I thought that the country was, as a child, I thought the country was created basically for me, which is sort of a Woody Guthrie sentiment. The challenge of the 20th century, the surprising political ideology of the 20th century globally was the rise of fascism. Fascism, there's another term that was actually consciously invented by somebody. It was invented by Benito Mussolini in the 1920s in post-World War I Italy. And in his fascist manifesto, a speech he gave in 1922, he defined fascism. He said, fascism is not an ideology. It is a will to power. And it doesn't really matter what positions you take as long as you are focused on acquiring and maintaining power. So what we see, and that played out, we saw it play out obviously across Europe in the middle of the 20th century. We had a fascist movement in the United States, and it took the form of populism, perhaps best personified by a man named Charles Coughlin, the Reverend Charles Coughlin, who applied many of the same disgruntled arguments to people that we have seen an appeal to in the last 10 years by some politicians. I don't think anybody is stretching too far to realize that this is sort of Sarah Palin's appeal to Joe Sixpack, saying, you are the people who were forgotten. You're the ones who were left behind. Washington doesn't care about you, but I'll care about you. Well, come on, Sarah Palin was a career politician as well. And she was a textbook example of somebody who pretended to be very folksy, pretended to be uneducated, pretended to be kind of outside the establishment, and was working really as a main figure in a very well-established political party and political capacity. And while she did in her early days, I think, some things that were very beneficial for the people of Alaska, she managed the relationship between oil companies and the state in such a way that may not have been great for the environment, but it was awfully good for the people of the state. They literally saw excellent oil revenues from that, if that's what you want to make your living off of. And she's a really good example of bringing that sort of Charles Coughlin disgruntlement back to the political center. And that becomes a blueprint that is later on used by the Trump campaign. What could be more ludicrous than a man who is born to a millionaire, who is raised in private schools, who gets $1 million loan from his father to start a business, functions as a slum landlord, in my opinion, and has a history of cheating the working class, the contractors and the people who do the heavy lifting for him. not to mention being a draft dodger, essentially, and not for political reasons. He was not a conscientious objector. He finds a sneaky way to claim medical exceptions. Here's a guy who has not pursued education based on his own merits. He does it on, as far as I can tell, family connections. He has not made himself, a self-made millionaire. He has all the advantages in life, and he goes traipsing around the country talking to working class people saying, I'm just like you. And there could be nothing more ludicrous than that person saying that he's just like them and that he understands them. And yet he taps into their feelings of resentment and disenfranchisement. That is populism. That is textbook populism. Did you want one for progressivism as well?
All right. Well, let's stay on that for just a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Let's stay on the Trump administration. Oh, another myth about him was that that being this self-made man, that he made all this money in business, but the man, as Christopher Titus likes to point out, he lost money in casinos where the way a casino works is people walk in, they hand the casino all their money, and then they leave. And you've got to be a special kind of stupid to lose money and go bankrupt running a casino.
Yeah. No, there's, casinos are a variation on a couple of other industries that exist in this world where the house almost always wins. Almost always, like 99% of the time. So frequently so that if you start winning, they start sending people down to the tables to look and see what you're doing. Are you counting blackjack or whatever? The insurance industry for many years was really very similar. They weren't taking bets that they didn't know that they could win. Not just believe that they could win, but know that they could win. And for a variety of reasons, insurance is becoming a more difficult industry to make a living in, but the house still wins more often than not. Right. And I think it's generous of you to say that you have to be a special kind of stupid to lose money, because in fact, it is the odds are so much in your favor in casinos that it really raises suspicious questions of, are you stupid or are you clever? And you're finding a way to use failure to your advantage. And we know that happens frequently with tax situations, creating losses. I mean, let's face it, for most of the 20th century, before the Cuban Revolution, there were a bunch of casinos in Havana, and they were being routinely used by mafia interests to launder money. So, you come along to the 1970s and the 80s and 90s, and all of a sudden casinos are open for business in places like Atlantic City and, in New Jersey. And if you lose money there, it raises the question if you're actually perhaps, I don't know, maybe laundering money for somebody. So there's all, and we are, you can say I'm a conspiracy theorist here, but remember, who is it that taught us in the last 10 years to be suspicious and to think of conspiracies behind everything? Oh, yeah, Donald Trump, right? Hasn't he trained us all to think about conspiracies? So now when we turn around and think that maybe he's part of some conspiracy or was in his past, is that really surprising? I want to go one other place. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
If we're going to talk conspiracies, I watched This Morning last week tonight with John Oliver, and it was all about RFK Jr. And if
in the news again today, yep, for the bear incident in Central Park. Have you seen that news?
Talk about that. Tell that story.
So a number of years ago, I mean, RFK, and I want to say a few good words on his behalf, because I'm an eternal optimist and faith runs eternal. I try to find good things in people. He was a great environmental lawyer, when he was young, he really was. I think, from my personal position, he was focused on good stuff. And somewhere along the line, he made the mistake that lots of us make in the 21st century, which is that he thought his Google searches were equivalent to somebody's medical degree. So he moved on from thinking about environmental justice into the area of evaluating vaccines. And I got to tell you, I've known a number of people. I'm in my 60s. I've known a number of people older than me who lived through periods of American history when polio was rampant. They walk with crutches. Some of them have braces on their legs. They're in their 80s. And these are the ones who survived. And they'll tell you about the people who didn't survive. So we know that for a number of huge issues, vaccines were very, very helpful. Does that mean every vaccine was a success? No, we know also, if you paid attention in 7th or 8th grade science and you learned how the scientific method operates, science advances by fits and starts. And there are mistakes sometimes. Think about the drug that was common throughout Europe in the 1950s that people thought was going to assist pregnant women with nausea. The drug was called thalidomide. And it was blocked from coming into this country by one staff member in what eventually became the Food and Drug Administration. And thank goodness she blocked it. It ended up being the source of many, many birth defects in children. And it didn't happen in the United States. So it's not that science is always perfect. But when you think that your law degree, it puts you in a position to evaluate how vaccines are being made now. And when you start making claims about things like, vaccinations and the relationship to autism, and the science, the overwhelming preponderance of the medical community is in disagreement with you, to continue, as you say, holding your ground.
Studies
and this is something
that
people
include millions.
Yeah.
Have disproven this. But it goes back further than that. You talk about his scientific, his work for the environment. None of those environmental organizations are endorsing him. Not a one.
Right.
But his propaganda that he's been putting out, it goes back to the 80s, in fact.
Yes.
He was putting out propaganda and lies regarding AIDS, just flat out falsehoods regarding AIDS, and Dr. Fauci, who came up with the first treatment for AIDS.
Right. And this is well, let's go to the bear story that is featured in the New Yorker this week, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has given an interview talking about this to try and kind of get ahead of this story. At some point a number of years ago, there was a bizarre incident in which he was going out on a falconing trip, which of course all Americans do, right? It's such a weird thing to be doing.
We all go on falconing trips. Yeah, you can win, by the way, a trip to go falconing with RFK Jr. That's one of the, I signed up to try and win tickets to the Democratic National Convention. I can't even imagine. Go on. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's okay. You're right. I mean, it's so bizarre. So he's going out somewhere in New York State to go falconing, and he sees a bear cub get hit by a car. The car keeps going. He collects the bear cub because he's going to take it home and skin it and process the meat, which is legal. You can do that. You must register it with the state. New Hampshire has some similar policies. You can do this sort of thing. But he gets distracted along the way, and he goes out drinking with friends, and he's got other things to do. And there's this bear carcass in his car, and he finally um, after a night of drinking, he and his friends decide to make it look like a bicycle accident in Central Park, and they dump the carcass and they dump an old bicycle, and then it's on the news the next day, and it's this big, oh my gosh, what really happened here? Get the SPCA out, and what it goes to is, and he's an adult. This is a man who is been through law school at that point, and is a practicing attorney. He's an adult. This is not. This is the kind of thing you expect from
He was what,
a
in his
first.
40s?
Right, and you expect it from a college freshman who's drunk. So what it goes to is, this is not, because somebody drinks. Lots of people do, but this goes towards judgment issues, towards thinking about what's a reasonable thing to do. What are the results of this? Now we take this back to what are the consequences of telling people that AIDS is a figment of people's imagination, that it's not a real disease, and some of that was pushed by a scientist out in California who later on had to admit that he was incorrect about this, but it held up because a bunch of people wanted to believe that for other reasons. It held up research in this country, and people's lives were lost. And that's the thing you always have to think about here. This is not even the butterfly effect where, there's 25 degrees of separation between what you do and what happens. When you start attacking science like Robert F. Kennedy and some of the people he espouses have attacked Anthony Fauci, we see what happens. People die. In my community, and I'm living in this micropolitan community, one of the first people to die of COVID when it was breaking out here was a man who used to come into the library regularly. He had some cognitive disabilities. He's what you might have referred to as an idiot savant. He was brilliant with numbers. Everyone in our city of 9,300 people really knew who he was. He bicycled all over the place because he couldn't drive. And he knew everyone's zip code and everyone's phone number. And he knew zip codes from all across the country and area codes. And he was just a numbers sort of, as I say, a savant. The problem was we couldn't convince him of two things. Number one, how to wear a mask and why you wear a mask. And secondly, why that was a really bad time period to be hanging out in bars. So he would work at the library, and then he would bicycle home and stop at bars along the way. He spent the last month of his life, Amy, in a medically induced coma at a clinic about an hour and a half away from here, literally the last month of his life, from just before Thanksgiving to just around Christmas, and then he died without ever regaining consciousness. And the people around him, in the bars that he went to, where they insisted that there was no reason to do this. These are people who, I don't know, maybe they weren't paying attention in ninth grade science or whatever. Mm-hmm. If you have a car accident and you have a broken leg, the EMTs show up and they put masks on. It's not because they think they're going to catch a broken leg from you. Right. It's because they are protecting your open wound from any germs they may be bringing in. Right. So you get all these people who got together and said, Fauci doesn't know what he's talking about. Wearing a mask won't protect you from getting COVID. Correct. Right. Sure. It will prevent you from giving it to someone.
It will.
This killed people.
Right. The point of the mask is if you're wearing one, you are less likely to spread through droplets.
Right.
COVID. And if you are wearing one, you are also less likely to catch it. So, right. If both you and I have on masks, then we have a greater level of protection. And I don't want to even talk about someone close to me, as in my immediate family, going into bars during COVID, going into restaurants when there was a mask mandate, refusing to wear one. First off, let's start with the job of a waitress is one of the worst in the world and one of the lowest paying. Their job is already awful. And they're doing their job in the middle of a pandemic, which means they are getting a lot of exposure. So you are taking that person who has this horrible, horrible job and making her job that much worse.
Right, right. And you know, the sad part is there's a there's a scary gender aspect to this as well, which is that many of the people, and we go back to our populism versus progressivism conversation, which is many of the people who were encouraged through a kind of a almost like a bar culture network to resist accepting the findings of the medical community, even as it proceeded in fits and starts, and sometimes they second guessed themselves, which then was played on by populists to suggest, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Those scientists, you can't trust them. They're lying to you. And that was played on and pushed. And it was pushed primarily to men. And men already frequently, I mean, if you've ever read any sociology studies done on waitresses, the number of women who get groped, who get drinks spilled on them deliberately for the purpose
I did it many years.
Yep. And so there was a real sort of a power differential here, which is it already exists in the world of waitressing, which is that a lot of male customers think that the waitress is there, you know, I'll be your servant for the day, for this evening kind of thing. Think about the words, I'm your server, I'm your servant. And they think that, well, if she's going to earn a tip, and you know, if they give a 15% tip, it's stunning. But if she's going to earn her tip, she's got to let me do whatever. Well, how is that different from them thinking, by definition, she's a prostitute? I pay her money, she must let me do anything. And so there is a kind of a culture here that pushes that. And there she is getting her, you know, $4 an hour pay because she's supposed to make all the rest of her money with her tips. And she's got to tolerate this stuff. And now add into it, oh yeah, and they think they have the right, a constitutional right to give her an infectious disease. Nobody in this country has a constitutional right to give other people a disease.
That's right. Absolutely not. You know, you have a right to swing your arm as long as you don't impact my face with it.
Precisely. Right. And you know, it becomes, you know, the droplets, it becomes the breathing. You have the right not to wear a mask until somebody else is within range of inhaling what you are exhaling. You don't have a constitutional right to give other people diseases. That's the bottom line. Right.
And this conspiracies, I think, and populism kind of go hand in hand throughout history. If you go back to the era with the conspiracies about AIDS, for example, that populism and the AIDS conspiracies go together, but you can go way far back to the Dark Ages in Europe and the plague. The plague was spread by rats, but there's you know, the
blood libel. You could go all the way to the blood libel, which is, yeah, you get into, say, you know, some parts of particularly in mountain regions where there's more isolated communities because they're harder to get to, and even as late as the 1980s, there were festivals being celebrated in the Apennines and, you know, in the area between Italy and the rest of Europe, those mountain communities where they would celebrate their victory over the Jews who were you know, infecting them with these parasites, and it's a little mind-boggling to think that within our lifetime people were repeating this and celebrating it, saying, oh well, those people came here, those Jews must have come here and brought us diseases. And you know, again, there's no understanding of microbes or of germ theory, so there has to be an explanation. And of course, the reason we tend towards those conspiracies is I will say this, we've lived through 9/11, we've lived through a number of other sort of horrifying moments. It is, we are hardwired to accept an explanation of malevolence before we accept an explanation of incompetence. It is hard for us for many people in our society to believe that 9/11 is a result of somebody dropping the ball in terms of security versus, oh, they must have known it was going to happen. And it's not, I can't blame Donald Trump for all of this. Let's go all the way back. The baby boomers have lived through a lifetime of conspiracy theories. The primary ones were the smoking gun theory about Pearl Harbor, that Franklin Roosevelt knew it was coming and let it happen, which is probably not so. But notice I have to use the word probably because I can't prove something that didn't happen. And of course, we all grew up with JFK and Oliver Stone, and that's my generation. We grew up thinking that, and partly you've got the CIA out trying to give exploding pens and cigars to Fidel Castro. So we're all thinking that it's the Wild West, like the steampunk show that used to be on TV. So we're more comfortable believing in malevolence than incompetence.
Well, and going back to RFK Jr. and blood libel, well, RFK Jr. just couldn't resist bringing back blood libel and saying that the COVID virus was designed to not affect Chinese and Jews.
Yeah.
Specifically, Jews like me, Ashkenazis, which is Eastern European.
Eastern European, as opposed to the Sephardic. It's again, there's a weird synergy that conspiracies exist alongside each other with. And then they start to morph. They start to kind of fuse together until you get these conspiracies that lead into conspiracies that lead into conspiracies. Years ago, probably in the 1970s, I love science fiction. And of course, science fiction is never really about science. Well, I shouldn't say never. Most of it is really sociology. Most of it is about relationships between people and how we interact with the other or with undefined threats and things. Somebody wrote a kind of a tongue-in-cheek science fiction book about the Illuminati, and it was like the superstring theory of conspiracies. Every conspiracy you can imagine was brought forward to be part of this book, which was entertaining. And it was supposed to be entertaining. It wasn't supposed to be a textbook for people to be paranoid. But what we see now, and here again, this is, the difference between the progressive and the populist. The progressives aren't going to jump on these conspiracy theories that are unproven and not constructive. And there's the real issue is, it's one thing to have an investigation and get to the bottom of something, because there's a constructive element to that. How do we, going forward, make people's lives safer, better, cleaner, healthier, whatever? The populist uses those stories, those conspiracy theories, to scare people into action. And anytime someone's trying to merely scare you, you got to step back and say, what's happening here? Where can we go with this? Are you just trying to get me to be the foot soldiers in your campaign to be a political, a dictator or whatever you want to define yourself as? Or is there a way that this, getting to the bottom of this, actually constructively makes life better? If the only purpose of a conspiracy is to justify you shooting up a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., it's not really helping us. And it's surely not saving any of those imaginary children that QAnon was talking about.
Well, and I want to point out that it's not just that it's anti-Semitic, but RFK is an equal opportunity offender. And so he has insulted the uh, he's insulted both Jews and he's insulted the the population of Palestine, so that he's called them pampered and I'm. What else did he say? Oh, but you know, he's attacked both sides. So if you're Jewish and you think that RFK is the answer, well, maybe look a little bit into his bringing back of blood libel. And if you're, pro-Palestinian, maybe look into what he said about that. Because
Right.
he's not on
Right.
your side in either way. The main focus is to help another crook, criminal, populist get elected. And there are
Right.
plenty of pictures of him with Michael Flynn and Roger Stone. And if you don't know who Roger Stone is, you're just tuning into this show for the first time. Roger Stone is a comic book criminal. He's a comic book villain. He even dresses like one.
Roger Stone is a canvas for a Richard Nixon tattoo, and that pretty much sums him up right there, right?
I mean, yeah. If you're gonna get a tattoo, which I'm not into tattoos. I don't. But your skin is an organ. It's your largest organ, and I don't believe in injecting poison into your largest organ. I wouldn't inject it into my heart or my lungs or anything else. I'm not injecting it into my skin. But if you're gonna get one, if that's your thing, fine, whatever. But Richard Nixon, the face of Richard Nixon, you're gonna get between your shoulder blades as big as life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And Roger Stone is one of these people who sort of lives to screw things up. His goal in life is to be a fly in the ointment. And again, this is some sort of an ego trip. This is a power trip. It's not making lives better, including the lives of people who support him. And therein lies, I think, perhaps the largest difference between populists and progressives is that the populists really don't care if your life gets better as long as theirs is superior. Whereas the progressives, do they lose sleep at night if your life doesn't get better? Yes, they do. And that is a long tradition. Like here in Wisconsin. Okay, so let's go back to Wisconsin history. Wisconsin becomes a state in 1848. In Germany, in 1848, there are a series of failed revolutions against the political elite, the Junker class, which was the aristocracy, and those revolutions are they're very much working class people. They are people who believe in democracy, and they fail. They fail because, honestly, the Junker class has military options. Otto von Bismarck is one of perhaps the best known example of the Junker class. And what happens to all of those Germans who believe in taking care of each other, in workers' rights, in not having 6-day working weeks with 14-hour days? They get out of Germany. Otto von Bismarck is in the process of fighting a handful of wars from the 1840s to the 1870s that will create a unified Germany. And people who believed in democracy got out. They just got out. Where did they go to? Well, I'm glad you asked. They come to Wisconsin. Wisconsin develops based on a tradition brought by German, what in European terms were called liberals. It was a different, the European political spectrum is a little bit different. And fundamentally, the idea was that working people should be able to gather together and equalize their leverage versus that of factory owners, so that they were not subject to labor abuse. They wanted land. They wanted the availability of land. They wanted to be able to produce their own crops. And they wanted a say in governance. They wanted democracy. And they took care of each other. They believed that government was what 20 years later, Abraham Lincoln, well, not quite 20 years, about 17 years later, Abraham Lincoln says, government is of the people, by the people, for the people. And the Germans who came to Wisconsin believed in that. And so we have this long tradition that comes in the 20th century to be called socialism. It's a little bit different, but Wisconsin has a socialist tradition. Milwaukee had a socialist mayor. We had a socialist senator from this state. And the long tradition was you take care of your neighbors. They move in, you help them move in, you help them blend into the community. And it wasn't just a melting pot. It was a little bit more of a tossed salad. So you end up with Swedes and Norwegians and Finns in northern Wisconsin and Croatians and Serbians in Milwaukee and Poles and people from all over those places. And then when you get to the 1920s, we start getting Italians and more Southern Europeans. And the idea was that we built communities and we took care of people. Post Joe McCarthy, move into the world of the Cold War, and socialism, even in its pre-World War II form, gets to be a dirty word. But what we built this state on was the idea that we are community and we take care of each other. That's baked into that progressive idea. Nowadays, if you say that, if you say you want to take care of your neighbors, unless you use a church group as an excuse to do it, you get called a socialist. Now, I don't mind the church groups doing it. I think that's also a great thing, provided everybody gets to choose their own organization, provided that your church isn't forced on everyone in the community. That's a different topic, isn't it? That's a whole nother question about what those framers actually meant by freedom from an established religion and so forth. But yeah, that's Wisconsin's history.
Well, we're coming kind of to the end of the show here, but one of the things we talked about, I started the show with Pete Seeger, and we're going to end with a little Woody Guthrie. I'd like to talk about songs like "This Land Is Your Land," which has kind of become an alternative national anthem, but most people don't get past those first three verses, because when you get past the first three verses, that's when you start seeing the progressivism,
right,
and socialism really become a part of the song.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that. People don't get past the first part. And there's kind of a bookend here. I mean, there's Woody Guthrie singing "This Land Is Your Land," and I'm going to throw a pitch in for myself here, a shameless pitch that I have been endorsed in the race for the Wisconsin State Assembly by the AFL-CIO of Wisconsin, and that is because I have always been concerned. I've had to work my entire life, and I have always been concerned that the people who are working get respect. All work is honorable, and that we are able to make a decent living so that you don't have to live, as Tom Petty said, like a refugee. And of course, at the other end of the bookend, besides Woody Guthrie, is his son, Arlo Guthrie, who famously sang a song called "Deportee." And what happened to an airplane filled with deportees in California way back in the 1970s, and the plane crashed, and nobody really had any identification for those people. They just called them deportees. And so they were deprived of their human identity. And here, one of the things I think we are going to have to do in this country, because we are facing a demographic cliff in terms of working people, is we're going to have to think about how we bring more people into the country, how we create a legal pathway for people, and also how we don't treat children who were brought here with no control over their own fate, brought here by parents. We can't treat them as so-called illegals. No human being is an illegal. And they,
That's right.
Those dreamers, they are not criminals. They are not criminalians, as one person used to tell me they were. And all work is honorable, and respecting how we work and work together is crucial to maintaining our country as a giant community.
Well, I want to pause for just a second. I'm bringing in my friend Dr. Esther Davis, who hosts the show After Mine. Esther, today we are speaking with Elizabeth McCrank. She is running for the Wisconsin Assembly District
35.
35.
35.
Hello, hello, hello. How are you?
I'm well, doctor. How are you?
I'm doing well. I've heard part of the discussion, and it's marvelous. Because you're with a good person. You're with the greatest.
I don't know. I may be the guest who talks the most. Amy's going to have to
Good.
put
No,
a
that's
mute
good.
on me.
We want to hear from you.
Well, let's go back to this Woody Guthrie song, This Land Is Your Land. And I just want to read a couple of the verses that you rarely hear. The ones, they stop at that third verse.
Okay.
And you don't hear
The fourth
4,
verse?
5, 6.
You mean
And
there's more than one? There are
that's-
4, 5, 6 verses to that song? I've
There's-
never heard. Oh my gosh.
so I'm going to start with the fourth verse. As I went walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said no trespassing. But the other sign, it didn't say anything. That side was made for you and me.
Mm-hmm.
But then the next verse really gets into it. In the shadow of the steeple, I saw my people. By the relief off, I seen my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking, is this land made for you and me? Nobody living can ever stop me as I go walking that freedom highway. Nobody living can ever make me turn back. This land was made for you and me. So those 3 verses,
Wow. Wow.
those are the controversial ones nobody sings anymore.
I have not heard that. I knew there was some more verses because I'm a musician. So somewhere along the way, I do recollect that there is some other verse. But that is beautiful. That is absolutely beautiful.
It is. And it's a theme that has been running through American history since day one. There are a handful of people who came here in the 1600s and took a bunch of land, a lot of land, and made themselves very wealthy. And some of their descendants still are the dominant wealthy families in this country.
Oh, they sure are.
And we keep coming back to this even in the 1960s and 70s. Remember the 5-man band singing "Sign, Sign, Everywhere a Sign," and they said long-haired freaky people need not apply. Mm-hmm. So we've been coming back to this question over and over and over again. Whose country is it really? And it's physical. That's a physical question, but it's a moral and a spiritual question as well.
And sometimes we forget the big names at the top of all of this land grabbing. I was a big fan of Ted Turner's, the guy who started CNN. And he lived somewhere up there, Montana, Wyoming, one of those open states, wide open states. And he owned an awful lot of land. And he probably still does. But it's in Texas. Texas is really only, as large as Texas is, the largest state in the union outside of one other, Alaska. But Texas is only about 9 or 10% occupied. The rest of it is just land mass and tall timbers and a bunch of creeks and rivers running through it. But it's amazing how much land there is that this song doesn't really do it justice because we should know about the land. And I think right now one of the questions that comes up a lot in my world is, why is everybody moving to Texas? Well, my first answer to that is we have a land mass for it. And we do.
Right.
We do.
Right.
So, but it's a beautiful country.
And Esther, you make a really good point, which is this. I mean, one of the arguments against expanding work visas and immigration opportunities for people is, we're too crowded and we don't have enough resources. You know what?
No.
That's not so.
That is not
we
so.
got lots of room, and we're happy to, in my opinion, we should be happy to take anybody who wants to make a positive contribution here.
Well, you know what? I love that. I love that statement because that's been another point of contention. It's been a conversation. We need the people at the border. We've always had people at the border. They're not criminals. They are people that come in and want to work and do good work when they get here. I mean, can you imagine not having any Mexican food in Texas?
I have
Nope.
to tell you,
And you know,
I love Mexican
there's a
food.
song that I've played a number of times on this show. Who's gonna build your wall?
No.
Who's gonna build
Right.
your wall? Who's gonna make your Mexican food when your Mexican chef is gone? Who's gonna wipe the faces of your
Yep.
child
Right.
when their maid is gone?
Right. Well, you know,
No.
another word for immigrant is employee. Another
Yes.
word for immigrant is tenant. Another word for immigrant is entrepreneur. Another word for immigrant is customer. This is who we are. What
Absolutely.
madness possesses us to say no?
Well, I don't really understand that, because if anybody has been in Texas or any of the other states, one of my children is in Chicago and Wyoming, and everywhere has some form of integration. And they get along in the neighborhoods. They get along just fine. I have a guy in my neighborhood that mows the neighbor's yard, and then we want all of the yards mowed, but he will do that. I know him, and the resident, they moved the mom to someplace else. So we have all these good deeds going on around us, and that's what makes the difference. We can't believe everything that we hear. That's the bottom line right there. Can't believe that.
Right. Right.
So let's just wrap up because we're running out of time. First, I want you to tell everyone, how can they learn more about your campaign, Elizabeth?
Sure. Thanks for giving me that opportunity. So we do have a website. I have the funniest last name in the world, and as a kid I hated it, but I love it now. So it's like MC Crank, like a rapper or a cranky person. So the website is one long word, McCrank for the people. That's MCCRANK for the people.com. And people who want to make donations, if you're living in a safe district, in terms of electing progressives, I'm not, right? If you want to make a donation to my campaign, you can go to Act Blue and you can Google my name, Elizabeth, just like Queen Elizabeth of England, and McCrank, MCCRANK. Or you can send me messages on the website. You can say hello. If you don't have any money, that's okay. If you have an opinion, I'm good with that too. Ideas matter. So and thank you, Amy. I want to just say thank you. This was a lot of fun. You can tell I like talking about history. I like talking about politics. I like talking about America. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have joined you here today.
Well, I want to thank you, and I
Wow.
want to thank you. We didn't quite get you on camera. I'm now seeing.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. The next show, you're on my show.
Yeah.
So we've got lots of Elizabeth. It was a pleasure, such a pleasure to meet you, and
And
As
listen
well,
to your ideas.
thank you so much.
And I wish you so much luck in your upcoming election. We're going to end the show with just a little bit of "This Land Is Your Land." And I remind you every week, get registered, get informed, get politically active, and go vote. And if you don't have anything nice to say, come sit by me.
This land is your land, and this land is my land. From the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. As I went a-walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway, saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, and I followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts. All around me a voice was sounding, This land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining, then I was strolling in the wheat fields waving and the dust clouds rolling. The voice was chanting as the fog was lifting. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land, and this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining, then I was strolling, and the wheat fields waving, the dust clouds rolling, the voice coming chanting, and the fog was lifting. This land